Warm welcome.
So hello, thanks for staying on. And I'm going to talk to you about the relationship between standards and going to volume. And particularly, I'm going to talk about the impact on individual citizens. Quite a lot of title there. I think what I really want to focus on is, in the future market, what's actually going to change so that things will go to high volume. And there are a lot of buzzwords around in the industry. I'm prone to talking about the fourth industrial revolution and about changes that are happening in the way that city platforms are coming together. I want to try and address how platform standards can be translated into new ways of doing things. And some of this I'll come on to, is out of work that I did in the earlier part of this year with ETSI, the European Telecom Standards Institute, where a group of people got together and tried to figure out how standards could actually accelerate the smart city market in terms of replication and so on. What I want to start with is this sort of rather simplified flow between artificial intelligence at one end and massive IoT at the other, with all the comms in the middle, which we'll sort of take for granted that we've got a highly available, redundant, low latency connectivity with bits of other, maybe some 5G stuff and whatever, but at least we're going to be heavily connected. Let's take that as a given. What I think is going to change the way that citizen systems will deploy is that artificial intelligence is moving up a particular value chain. We sort of jumped straight in Greenwich with some early trials starting 3 years ago of autonomous vehicles, which are in the sort of autonomy end of artificial intelligence with LiDAR-based analytic systems and using similar sort of machine learning to what you might have seen on the Vapice stand over there. But what we're all experiencing as consumers is the move from internet AI into business AI and transactions, and then into perception AI and the beginning of identification and recognition systems. And what that's leading to on the other end, when you look at the IoT interaction, is the ability to drive edge intelligence and distributed ledger technology, and then linking through to online to offline transitions, so that transactions are actually moving into the real world, and then moving on to OMO, online mergers to offline, where you're actually making transactions in the physical world, it's being processed in the digital world and then coming back at you in the physical world again. So maybe you're just walking out of a supermarket with some goods and the transactions are happening. Everything you're doing is in the physical world, but there are actually complex transactions going on in terms of identification and pricing and the actual transaction ledgers are being maintained. In an urban environment like Greenwich, and this is a CGI of how Greenwich is going to look in a few years' time. These buildings down the front line are half built. That's the O2 arena on the right, and the big 3 towers there is a future tube station that is going to be put in over the next few years with a big atrium and all sorts of fantastic stuff in there. When that operating city gets stripped down to some sort of platform, well, how do you think about what's underneath it? And how do you get any sort of replicability and standardization? When we started looking at this nearly 4 years ago in Greenwich, we went to Santander and we looked at the system that was in use there, which at the time I think was, by some distance, the best implemented smart city platform. And this was the architectural model that we looked at. This is courtesy of NEC, who are the vendors of this system to Santander. And it's a fairly classical data standard with inputs coming in from IoT devices and with various bits of dashboard and so on the other side, and a good fireware sign to recognize all the money that are coming from the European Union in terms of fireware support. But does it actually address that situation? Is it actually still fit for purpose? It's a very serviceable model, but is it a model we should be designing towards now? And to what extent should we be moving to new standards and trying to implement citizen-based build-ups rather than thinking in terms of these big platforms as being the sort of city-centric view of what's going on? So let's look at a couple of extracts from this white paper that was published in April 2018, called The Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Municipal CEO. It's a free download. It's about 6 pages. You're welcome to grab it. I think Fourth Industrial Revolution Municipal will probably get it on any search engine. And one of the things that we built up there was this view that the service platform could be extended case by case, so that in this particular one, we start with 2 examples, traffic monitoring and environmental sensing, and then put the service angle across them in terms of the AI analytics and the security policies and the industry policies and so on. But then do it in such a way that it's designed to be replicated. Now, the key thing here, I think, is to have an ability to design across all these use cases requires you to have an architecture that can scale, not just in terms of physical coverage, but also that you can reuse some of the same sensor infrastructure and networks for all the different use cases. And I think that's the absolute key point that I see in terms of standards evolution. That the more that you have convergent planning, the more you can deliver convergent services which run off unified platforms. And that's where the cost saving comes, and that's also where the improved integration of services comes from. Because one of the things that you're moving towards is to be able to suck up all this edge IoT and then to feed it into intelligence. And in this case, you're not having to suck it physically into a big data lake, but you're actually engaging in, probably in the near future, in a machine learning approach to understanding what's going on in terms of the various algorithmic relationships between different parts of data, and then producing rich analysis. So that's a model which needs a considerable amount of thought. And if you thought that, most cities, if any of us who work in cities would, I think, immediately admit that our cultures are designed in silos. So it's almost inevitable that the people who do housing and the people who do roads and the people who do education will not be running off the same platforms because it's been too difficult in the past. So they'll have their own systems, their own processes, and there'll be then some sort of reconciliation across the top. So what we're looking at here is, how do you overcome that silo architecture and move to a pervasive standards-based deployment of Fourth Industrial Revolution products where you can begin to engineer the whole thing onto a common fabric. And this is, if you like, a slight modification. We've still got our 3 layers here on the left, the devices, the platform layer, and the application logic layer. The platform in this case is not necessarily a centralized physical platform, but it's actually the aggregation layer logically. And so you've got an initial expansion from launch, and then as citizens get more involved, you can pull in more data. Now that last little bit, that little loop on the end, is something I really want to focus on, because I think it's almost essential in the future that citizen-based data is the primary building block of future citizen services. It sounds absolutely obvious, but it's just not the way that usually things have been done. And what this hinges around is using GDPR as a positive force to create clarity in terms of data governance. So with GDPR, a citizen can provide data into a personal data trust, which can then be made available on conditions into different use cases. So that personal data trust can then be accessed by a number of users on a give once, read many basis. And that's the absolute building block that allows you then to start interacting with that citizen's data with consent, but also with consistent data, because it's not only consistent, it is actually the same data. It doesn't go anywhere. It stays in the personal data trust. It gets looked at by other systems, but it doesn't get copied. So you've got no problem with version control, and you've got no problem with update routines, because the data is the data. Now, there's a side benefit there in terms of the world of artificial intelligence, because what you're almost accidentally doing, I think this has evolved, is you're stripping out the metadata associated with the input of the data. Now, this is a sort of a nuance that I only really understood when I was doing a crash course in Chinese AI strategy, and a really interesting book I can recommend to you, which I should have a picture of really, because I'm going to steal share. It's not steal, share some thoughts from it by Kai-Fu Lee, who used to be the head of Google China, and last month published a book called AI Superpowers. Very, very insightful, but the particular point I want to highlight is that as you give away your data to an application provider on your phone, currently we don't have any clear definition of the IPR for the metadata. So if this is a device and I'm entering my credentials for a microloan, I'm putting in the stuff you'd expect, like my credit history and my expected use and when I want to pay it back and so on. What I'm also providing, probably, depending how the phone is signed on, is the day of the week I'm doing it, the time of day, the battery state of the phone, and how long it takes me to scroll through the little numbers to get my date of birth right. And those are all the sort of data elements that a machine learning system can use as part of its risk assessment. And it's not intentionally shared data, and it's currently not regulated. And at the moment, many financial institutions are gathering that metadata in an unrestricted way. And there's an issue with standards as to whether we can segregate the actual data from the metadata associated with it. I hope that's clear. It's a bit of an esoteric point if you're not into the finer points of machine learning, but it's become an example to me of the way that inadvertent sharing of IPR is dilutive of the citizens' rights, but it also inadvertently shares key data that people may not want to disclose and may not realize they're disclosing. If you can then actually get a better accuracy of loan, because you find that people are providing their data, if people are providing their data on a weak battery, it suggests they're not organized in life and therefore they're a worse credit risk. You don't know if that's the logic. The thing about the machine learning is it's not judgmental, it's just observing a correlation between loan recovery, battery state, day of the week. So logically you think people who asked for a loan near payday have probably got more chance of paying it back than people who ask just after they've been paid. And those sorts of things can get processed. Now, as you look at that world, how do we then move towards a standards base that accepts that that's a model? Now, we're starting the city from just loads and loads of people. And if you look at the world of 5G, all these segmentations have been provided for in the way that the 5G business model has been. It's just a different way of looking at it. This is actually from the 5G Innovation Centre in the UK at the University of Surrey. These are the key segments by order of value as to where the 5G transactions are expected to go. So this view is in the middle of this sandwich of intelligence and IoT as well. The transport layer is also trying to figure out what segments to work in. And if you slice it differently, this is another one from NEC, back in a sister to the previous diagram. Here we've got a layer view, and we used to use this one when we were doing trials of autonomous vehicles to say, well, here we are in the transportation and logistics network layer, and let's find our way in between the human network and the information network. And obviously, we're drawing on the energy network to power the vehicles. So we need to run a 4-layer model. Now, that's where the standards start to need very careful correlation, because energy standards and IT standards and human interface standards are usually coming from different houses. And what we're trying to do in the city is find coordination of all of those layers into a viable way forward. Now, my experience with the telecoms regulation side, or the telecoms standards-based work at ETSI, is that we tend to look towards the human layer, and particularly because very often the implementation of networks is focused on mobility and smartphones, and that's where the perception is that the citizen sits on the end of the network. It's a useful thought to look at what if we could actually see the data? What if we could actually look around if there are IT sensors in here and see them? And this is a Microsoft HoloLens augmented reality headset, or what Microsoft calls mixed reality, where it would become possible for citizens to actually be more aware of the immersive data that they're in. And one of the impacts there is the citizen realizes that they actually own their own data, so they could see the IoT data in their own buildings, in their own houses. They could see data going past in terms of the vehicles. Now, I think we're 5+ years away from that being operational, but if you look at Qualcomm's roadmap for the Snapdragon processors, this is from a Snapdragon. Well, actually, it's Qualcomm XR. There's a microsite called Qualcomm XR, Extended Reality, and this is on download as a vision slide set, which I was just sharing with somebody this morning, so I know it's still live. This is in a very interesting sequence of developments. This is towards the end of an evolutionary process where they're trying to address the extended reality into a citizen-ready model, and here's the indication of a stereoscopic camera. This is actually also in a version with a rear-facing camera, and if you look at the presentation, you will see a first responder use case where there are feeders coming into a firefighter and so on. The level of standardization that we're talking about has the potential to deliver not only uniformity, but also transparency. And as we then move down so that the devices become active, the devices themselves can become actors in a distributed ledger technology transaction system. So we've actually got visibility of what's going on, and then our sensors able to trade themselves. And I think this is where the whole technology curve is going. That the air quality sensors can sell their data as they see fit, and they can trade with each other. That in the house, if I'm ready to go out, one of my devices can negotiate with the various transport providers against my criteria of comfort and battery state and distance and price, and find me an offer. And that sort of arbitrage is going to go on. The more we sort out standards so that we have common trading, the more efficiency we deliver. And that's where I think the goal is of evolution of standards. It's all about citizen interaction. There's a long list of services that we're already working at. I'm not going to go through that list, but I would just highlight the voting and polling. In the midterms, there's a part of Virginia that is for the first time going to mobile voting as part of the US electoral system. I think it's likely that we'll get changes coming through standards-based and immutable records so that democracy itself can get modified through having standards-based citizen systems. There is a risk, however, and I just wanted to talk for a minute about whether that IPR is not well protected. I had the pleasure last month of being out in Toronto for a few days with a Harvard-sponsored innovation accelerator for artificial intelligence. And Toronto City are well down the track of smart city tech, and there were 17 other cities there sort of sharing their experiences. And we had a site visit to Sidewalk Labs, which some of you will know is Sidewalk is an Alphabet company, a sister company to Google, and is working on innovation. The week after we were there, well, this is the site actually, so it's actually in feeling, it's quite like this building. The Sidewalk Labs is an industrial building with a number of modular units. And if you imagine around the back there, if you imagine there was a sort of crossroads made out of wooden pallets, and then dynamic LED lighting to try and experiment with how people would move through dynamic lanes. That's what's going on in Sidewalk Labs. And then outside, there was a load of stuff where you could fiddle around with milk crates, and you probably build the whole thing for probably about $300,000 or $400,000. And this rather fabled intersection is probably about $5,000 worth of pallets and a few LEDs. But the attention that was going into it became highlighted the week after we were there, because this lady, Sadia Muzaffar, rather spectacularly resigned from the digital advisory panel for Toronto Waterfront, and made this comment in her scorching 2-page letter, which is worth a read just for the schadenfreude of not having received it. Broad licensing that does not prioritize digital rights of the public can mean that surveillance infrastructure and valuable public data can lay latent for long periods of time and avoid scrutiny easily tucked in a foreign-owned company's proprietary vault. So the Canadian-American thing has always been a bit tense. I say that as a former exec of Nortel Networks, which flew both flags, a Canadian company mostly operating with US production. And at this particular point, Canada is actually making a bit of a stand and saying, we need to maintain our own smart city IPR integrity, and we don't necessarily want to have our data presumed to be shared on a free license into all the other sites that Sidewalk are having a look at. I think the spirit of IPR independence is very similar in the Nordics and especially in Finland, and I think these arguments could easily play here, that some of this interaction data and some of these urban labs that we're all working on have got really significant impact in the future of human-machine interaction. And we need to think carefully about how we work towards standards collaboratively, but also how we protect ourselves from being hoovered up into some other sort of higher order offer. And as local authorities in that mix, there's, I think, a danger that we are disintermediated if we don't stay alert in this, and that if you want your bins emptied twice a week in the future, in a few years' time, that won't be an option unless you're on the Amazon Prime Plus option, which includes having your windows done twice a week and everything else, because the package of services will actually be managed in a commercial model, which uses a scale and a consumer intimacy which we're at risk of losing. So I think there's a carrot and stick here. I think there is a big prize for maintaining a standards-based architecture and for deploying into the city on a very intentional basis, so that there is shared infrastructure and so that there is concentration into the same devices and multiple use cases, because the payback comes from slicing those use cases 20 or 30 times so that they're riding off the same infrastructure. When it comes to you and I growing old and wanting care, we hope that we'll remain able to live independently, that we'll have the level of visibility to our family and friends and to healthcare and social care professionals, that our behavior will be nudged intelligently by people that we want to be nudged by, so that we remain healthy as long as possible, and so that we can actually have the quality of life that we hope to have. Now, many people have been talking about how old we and our children will be in 2030 or 2050, and I think those are very compelling arguments, that when we're in classic retirement age and our children are past their middle ages in many cases in these far out years, the society that we want to have is going to be different, but it's only one generation away. And the level of supervision that we will expect to be able to invite of our own lives is part of our own ability to live independently. This is about standards, but I'm inevitably talking about quality of life, about privacy, about intellectual property, and about business models that share stuff. I really also want to mention the whole finance issue, because I think once we've implemented standards, we can aggregate the market to a state where bond financing becomes possible at a national and potentially multinational level. That if you can introduce bond financing for smart city infrastructure, and to do that, you need to deal with public procurement regs and deal with standardization to be able to sell on an open standards basis. Then you can have competitive procurement in a framework, modify that framework through some sort of dynamic procurement system so that it's alive and it doesn't become stale and it can use SMEs and so on and so forth. And that procurement model can then feed the big engines of industrial investment. There's a lot of cash, as far as I can see, queued up, trying to get into the social fabric that we're talking about here. People have already said in more detail than I can now that one of the problems is cities are really difficult to deal with. We're all organized differently. There isn't any obvious basis of standards for replication. Everything's a one-off. There are so many proofs of concept. How many proofs of concept of the same technology we need before we go to scale? And the reason people keep on cycling around is I don't think we've cracked the scalability phase. And the two things that I would point to on that are finance structures and open standards. Put those two together, people get religion about standards because standards equal cheap money. So actually people don't care about standards. Very few people. Does anyone care about standards here? I slightly care. Yeah, okay, there's three of us. The rest, who cares about getting cheap services and cheap money or better quality, better value for money? Who wants better value for money? Oh, that's slightly more people, yes, okay. So how do you use those standards? The pitch isn't standards. The pitch is replication leads to better value for money. And without replication, well, if you get the replication, you then need a big bucket of cash that persuades risk-averse local authorities that they better get with the program or they're going to fall behind all the other local authorities. And I think that's true of competition. And everywhere we go, I've been talking with great interest to people about Finnish cities, and last week was in Sweden, just hearing more about what's going on in Norway. Cities are hesitant to take a risk, but nobody wants to be left behind. So if we can go to scale, then I think we're going to be in a good place. There are some concerns about this technology, and here's a sort of example, mixed blessings. In the spring of this year, the Chinese police deployed facial recognition using these glasses, which are facial recognition glasses, which are very similar to the Qualcomm ones I showed earlier. And they picked up 200 criminals who were wanted by just keeping an eye on everyone coming back home for the festival season. Is that good or is it bad? Obviously, there are a lot of ethical issues as to how identity is managed and what public privacy and what security should or shouldn't be able to do. That's not all bad, but you can see how that sort of state power needs to be regulated and needs to be understood so that our desire to be anonymous at times can be maintained if that's what we all agree should happen. But when we come now to the sort of babies of this generation, we are, as many people have already said, we're looking at a mature working out of all these sustainable development goals. We're looking to say, if we've got that sort of profile, as I said earlier, if you're here for the panel, we go to extreme ends to protect our babies in their car seats and with their stair gates and with their special cribs and all this stuff. That's, I think, the pivot point where we can take action and say, if we're not doing it for ourselves because we're frankly just a bit weary of trying to effect change, then I think the play is to this generation and say, although this is an awful lot of data, these global goals, when you start looking at the impact of climate change and air quality and congestion and all the things that are at risk of becoming lifestyle damaging for our young children growing up now, then it's time to take some action. I'm going to leave it there. You can rate my driving. There may be time for a question. And it's been a pleasure to share with you and to meet many of you on this brief visit. And I hope we can stay in touch, and do grab me afterwards. I have to say I'm not here tomorrow, so if you do want to talk, either grab me now or grab a card or something. I'll be very glad to stay in touch. But I've got to leave shortly after the next conversation. Thanks very much.